She stood in my living room, eyes gleaming like a magpie's, telling me those jewels belonged to her now. What I placed in her hands that day, well, let's just say it wasn't what she expected. My name is June, and at 80 years old, I've learned that the most precious things in life aren't always made of gold and diamonds. Though Lord knows, I've got my share of both. This collection has been 60 years in the making, but its story stretches back even further. It began with my great-grandmother Clara, who arrived in America in 1885, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small silver locket containing her mother's photograph. That locket was the foundation of everything that followed. Clara worked 16-hour days in a textile factory, saving every penny she could spare. When she finally had enough money, she bought her first piece of real jewelry, a simple gold band for her wedding day. She told my grandmother, "Mabel, this ring represents more than marriage. It represents the promise that our family will rise above poverty, that will create something beautiful in this new country." My grandmother Mabel inherited not just that ring, but Clara's determination. During the Great Depression, when families all around us were selling their valuables just to eat, Mabel held on to every piece Clara had managed to acquire. She added her own treasures slowly, carefully. The ruby brooch she bought to celebrate surviving the Spanish flu pandemic. The small diamond earrings she purchased with her first paycheck from the telephone company. "Jean," Mabel used to tell me when I was just a little girl, "these aren't just pretty things. They're our family's proof that we can endure anything. Each piece represents a victory, a moment when we chose beauty over bare survival." When Mabel passed in 1962, I was 22, and newly married to my Robert. The jewelry box she left me contained 17 pieces, each with a story, each purchased through sacrifice and saved through hardship. I remember opening that velvet-lined box for the first time as its new guardian, feeling the weight of responsibility. These weren't just accessories. They were talismans of strength, passed down through generations of women who had refused to let circumstances dim their light. Added my own pieces over the decades. The pearl necklace Robert gave me on our first anniversary, bought with money he'd saved from working double shifts at the steel mill. The emerald bracelet from our honeymoon in Ireland, chosen because Robert said the stones matched my eyes and would remind me that our love could survive anything, just like those ancient Irish stones had survived centuries of storms. When Sarah was born in 1975, I was 35 and so ready to share this legacy with a daughter. I remember holding her tiny fingers and whispering, "Someday, little one, these will help you remember where you came from, help you understand the strength that runs in your blood." As Sarah grew, our Sunday afternoon jewelry ceremonies became sacred time. I'd spread all the pieces on my vanity, and she'd sit cross-legged on my bed while I told her the stories. She loved the ruby brooch best, the way it caught the light, the drama of its deep red color. I told her how her great-great-grandmother Mabel had bought it after surviving the Spanish flu, how she'd said, "This red stone reminds me that life is precious and beautiful, even after we've seen death." "Tell me about the pearls again, Mama," Sarah would say, reaching up to touch the strand around my neck. I'd explain how cultured pearls were created through irritation, how something beautiful emerged from discomfort, just like our family had created beauty from struggle. Those were golden afternoons, my little girl's eyes wide with wonder as I fastened various pieces around her small wrists and neck. "Careful with great-great-grandmother's ring," I'd say as she admired the sapphire on her tiny finger. "See how it's still perfect after all these years? That's because it was loved and cared for, just like you will be." I thought I was teaching her about heritage, about the value of preserving family history. I thought she understood that each piece represented not just beauty, but the strength and sacrifice of the women who had worn them before her. I believed she was learning to see beyond the monetary value to the emotional truth beneath. I was wrong. The first hint of trouble came about 3 years ago, shortly after Sarah's divorce was finalized. She was 47 then, suddenly single after 22 years of marriage, facing the reality of supporting herself and her 2 teenagers on just her teacher's salary. I'd always admired Sarah's choice to become a high school English teacher. It wasn't lucrative, but she'd seemed genuinely passionate about literature, about inspiring young minds. Her ex-husband Mark had been an investment banker, and their divorce settlement, while fair, had left her in significantly reduced financial circumstances. "Mom," she said during one of our weekly dinners, her voice casual but her eyes focused intently on the pearl earrings I was wearing. "You know, I've been thinking about insurance valuations. With all the break-ins in the neighborhood lately, you really should have your jewelry properly appraised for coverage purposes." I paused, a fork full of pot roast halfway to my mouth. "Break-ins?" Mrs. Henderson mentioned something about a car being broken into, but I hadn't heard about house burglaries. "Well, you can never be too careful," Sarah said quickly. "I just think it would be smart to know what we're dealing with, security-wise. Some of those pieces are probably worth more now than when you got them. Vintage jewelry is having a moment." The way she said vintage made me wince slightly. When had my treasures become vintage? When had I become old enough that my jewelry was considered antique? Over the following months, these conversations became more frequent. Sarah would arrive with printouts from estate sales, auction houses, and jewelry appraisal websites. She'd casually mention articles she'd read about inheritance planning, about the importance of getting ahead of estate taxes. I saw this article about a woman who died without proper valuations. She told me one gray November afternoon, pulling up something on her phone. Her family had to pay penalties because they underestimated the worth of her jewelry collection for probate. They ended up having to sell pieces just to cover the tax bill. I studied my daughter's face as she scrolled through her phone, showing me photos of jewelry similar to mine. When had she become so focused on financial implications? When had she started looking at family heirlooms as potential tax burdens? "Sarah," I said gently, "I've had a will for 30 years. Margaret Chen has handled all my legal affairs since your father died. Everything is properly documented. But valuations change, Mom. What you paid for these pieces 40 years ago isn't what they're worth today. And some of them, like great-grandmother's pieces, you never had appraised at all." She was right about that. I'd inherited Mabel's jewelry based on sentimental value, not monetary assessment. The thought of having strangers examine and price each piece felt somehow sacrilegious, like asking an appraiser to put a dollar value on my wedding vows. "I'm not planning to go anywhere anytime soon," I said with forced lightness. "There's plenty of time to worry about such things." But Sarah's expression suggested she wasn't so sure about that. The requests became more direct as winter turned to spring. Sarah began asking to borrow pieces for specific occasions, each request accompanied by elaborate justifications. "Mom, you know that diamond tennis bracelet? The one Dad gave you for your 25th anniversary? I have this charity auction coming up. It's for the school district, raising money for new library books. It would be perfect with my new black dress, and people would ask about it, which would be great for conversation and networking. I love that bracelet. Robert had surprised me with it on our actual anniversary, presenting it to me over dinner at the restaurant where we'd had our first date. 25 years of love," he'd said as he fastened it around my wrist. "And hopefully 25 more. We'd gotten 18 more years before cancer took him, and that bracelet had never felt more precious than it did now." "It's not that I don't trust you with it," I said carefully, "but it means so much to me. It's one of the last gifts your father gave me." Sarah's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, Mom. I understand. It's just that you don't really go out much anymore, so I thought... But, of course, if you'd rather it just sit in your jewelry box, there it was again. The subtle suggestion that my life had shrunk to the point where beautiful things were wasted on me, that my age had somehow disqualified me from deserving jewelry that sparkled. By last summer, Sarah's approach had evolved. From subtle hints to something approaching campaigning. She'd arrive for our Sunday dinners armed with research, statistics, and increasingly urgent arguments about why I needed to make decisions about my jewelry collection. Mom, I've been reading about senior financial planning, she announced one hot August afternoon, settling herself at my kitchen table with a thick manila folder. Did you know that most elderly people significantly underestimate the value of their personal property for estate planning purposes? I was making her favorite lemon cake, the same recipe I'd used for her birthday every year since she turned 5. My hands, increasingly stiff with arthritis, struggled with the mixer, but I persevered. This ritual of baking for her was one of the ways I still felt useful, still felt like I was giving her something she valued. I've put together some information, she continued, spreading papers across my table like a financial advisor making a presentation. Look at these recent auction results for pieces similar to yours. I wiped my flour-dusted hands on my apron and reluctantly examined the printouts. Ruby brooches selling for $15,000. Pearl necklaces fetching $8,000. Diamond earrings bringing in $12,000 at estate sales. These are all from estates where people died without proper planning, Sarah explained, her voice taking on a lecturing tone I remembered from her teaching days. Their families had to sell quickly, often at below-market prices, just to settle tax obligations. I studied the photos accompanying these auction listings. The jewelry looked cold under the harsh lights of auction house photography, stripped of context, reduced to lot numbers and minimum bids. The descriptions were clinical. 14K gold setting, approximately 2 carats total weight, minor wear consistent with age. Sarah, I said slowly, these pieces in the auction photos, they're not just jewelry. They were someone's treasures. Some woman loved each of these pieces, wore them to celebrate special moments in her life. But that's exactly my point, Mom. Sarah's voice carried a note of impatience I'd been hearing more frequently. When that woman died, her family had to sell her treasures to strangers because they weren't prepared for the financial implications. Wouldn't it be better if her jewelry had stayed in the family, with people who could appreciate the sentimental value? The logic seemed sound on the surface, but something about it made my chest tight with anxiety. What exactly are you suggesting? Huamil, saying maybe it's time to think about transferring some pieces now, while you're still here to see them enjoyed. For tax purposes, gifting during your lifetime is much more efficient than waiting for estate distribution. Transferring. Gifting. Estate distribution. When had my daughter started speaking like an accountant instead of the little girl who used to play dress-up with my costume jewelry? And honestly, Mom, she continued, her voice gentler now, what's the point of having all these beautiful things if they never see the light of day? When was the last time you wore the emerald bracelet? Or the sapphire ring? I thought about that. The emerald bracelet lived in my jewelry box now, brought out only for the most special occasions. My social circle had diminished over the years. So many friends gone. Mobility issues making evening events challenging. But that didn't mean the bracelet had lost its meaning to me. If anything, it had become more precious, a tangible connection to happier times. I wore the sapphire ring to church last Sunday, I said quietly. To church. Sarah's tone suggested this wasn't quite the grand social occasion that justified wearing fine jewelry. Mom, I could wear these pieces to faculty dinners, to school, board meetings, to social events. People would see them and appreciate them. They'd get the attention they deserve. The attention they deserve. As if beautiful things were somehow wasted on a woman whose social calendar had grown quiet with age. That night, after Sarah left with her folder full of financial planning materials, I sat at my vanity looking at my reflection in the mirror. When had I become someone whose life seemed too small to deserve beautiful things? When had my age made me less worthy of wearing jewelry that sparkled? I opened my jewelry box and touched each piece gently. The pearl necklace still made me think of my first anniversary, when Robert was so proud to be able to afford something elegant for his young wife. The ruby brooch still reminded me of great-grandmother Mabel's strength during the pandemic. The diamond earring still carried the weight of Robert's love. His determination to mark our 25th anniversary with something that would endure. These pieces weren't just sitting unused. They were keeping me company, reminding me daily of a life fully lived, of love freely given and received. The final confrontation came on a rainy October morning when Sarah arrived unannounced, something she rarely did. I was having a particularly difficult day. My arthritis was flaring badly, making it hard to open jars or manage buttons, and I'd been feeling the weight of my isolation more heavily than usual. "Mom, I'm glad I caught you," she said, bustling, in with her coat dripping rain, carrying what looked like a professional camera, and that same manila folder, now considerably thicker. "I wanted to talk to you when we wouldn't be interrupted." She settled herself on my living room sofa with the authority of someone who'd already made decisions and was simply here to implement them. The way she arranged her materials on my coffee table reminded me uncomfortably of a sales presentation. "I've been doing more research," she announced, pulling out what I now recognized as professional photographs of my jewelry pieces. My heart sank as I realized she'd been systematically documenting my collection during previous visits, taking detailed photos when I was in the kitchen or bathroom. "Sarah, when did you take these pictures?" "Over the past few months," she said, dismissively as if this were perfectly normal behavior. "I wanted to get proper documentation for insurance purposes. Mom, I had these shown to 3 different appraisers, and the results are, well, they're significant." She spread out official-looking documents across my coffee table, each bearing the letterhead of established jewelry appraisal services. The numbers were staggering. $35,000 for great-grandmother's ruby brooch, $42,000 for the emerald bracelet, $28,000 for mother's pearl necklace. "Do you realize," Sarah said, her voice taking on an urgent tone, "that you're sitting on almost $300,000 worth of jewelry? $300,000, Mom. That's more than most people's entire retirement savings." I felt dizzy looking at those numbers, seeing my precious memories reduced to cold financial assessments. "You had my jewelry appraised without my permission? Without even asking me?" "I didn't take anything," she said defensively. "These are just photo appraisals, preliminary estimates." "But, Mom, the point is, you're living on a fixed income, worrying about expenses, when you have this enormous asset just sitting here unused." The word asset hit me like a physical blow. These weren't assets. They were pieces of my heart, fragments of my history, tangible connections to everyone I'd ever loved. "Sarah, these pieces, they're not investments. They're family heirlooms. They carry our history." Her expression hardened in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of her father during their worst fights. "Don't be naive, Mom. History doesn't pay for medical bills. Sentiment doesn't cover the cost of home health aides or assisted living facilities." "I'm not ready for assisted living," I said quietly, but my voice sounded uncertain even to my own ears. "Maybe not today," Sarah pressed. "But what about next year? What about when your arthritis gets worse, or if you have a fall? What if you need round-the-clock care? Your savings won't last forever, But this jewelry collection could secure quality. Care for the rest of your life? The fear in her voice was real, and for a moment, I softened. Sarah had watched her father deteriorate slowly, had seen how expensive his final care had been despite our insurance. Perhaps her concern was genuine, born from love rather than greed. But then she pulled out another set of documents, and I saw a different truth. I've been researching estate tax implications, she continued, and there are significant advantages to transferring ownership now, rather than waiting for inheritance. If we set up a family trust, or if you gift me pieces gradually, over the next few years we could save thousands in taxes. There it was, the real motivation. Not fear for my future care, but concern about maximizing her inheritance. Not love for the family history these pieces represented, but calculation about their financial potential. Besides, she added, her voice taking on that coaxing tone I'd learned to dread, I'm your only heir. These will be mine eventually anyway. Wouldn't it make more sense for me to have them now, while I'm young enough to enjoy them? While I can actually use them? Young enough. Use them. As if at 80, I was already dead and simply hadn't had the courtesy to make it official. I've even thought about which pieces I'd start with, Sarah continued, apparently not noticing my growing distress. The emerald bracelet, for instance. When was the last time you really wore it? And the sapphire ring is practically an antique now. It would be safer in my jewelry box, where it would get more attention. Safer in her jewelry box. More attention. As if my own home, where these pieces had lived for decades, was somehow inadequate. As if I were too old, too irrelevant to properly care for beautiful things. I need to think about this, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's smile was triumphant, predatory. Of course, Mom. Take your time. But don't wait too long. You never know what might happen, and it would be terrible if... Poor planning cost us tens of thousands in unnecessary taxes. That phrase, cost us, echoed in my mind long after she'd left with her folders and photographs and financial projections. When had my jewelry collection become ours? When had my life become something to be managed and optimized rather than lived and treasured? I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. Instead, I found myself walking through my house at all hours, looking at everything with new eyes. The antique dining set where we'd hosted countless family celebrations. The china cabinet filled with wedding gifts from 60 years of marriage. The photo albums documenting decades of birthdays, graduations, anniversaries, ordinary Tuesday afternoons that had somehow added up to a life. Had I failed as a mother? Had I somehow raised a daughter who could only see the price tag on family? Memories? Or was this simply what happened when love collided with financial pressure? When adult children started seeing their elderly parents as sources of inheritance, rather than human beings deserving of dignity and respect? On the third, sleepless, night I called my attorney. Margaret Chen had been handling my legal affairs for 20 years, ever since Robert's death, and I trusted her judgment more than anyone's. Jean, it's 3 a.m. Are you all right? I realized I'd been so absorbed in my thoughts that I hadn't noticed the time. Margaret, I'm sorry to wake you, but I need to ask you something confidential. If I wanted to protect certain personal items from being treated as mere inheritance, what options would I have? There was a long pause, and I could almost hear Margaret's sharp, legal mind processing the implications of my question. Jean, has something happened with Sarah? The kindness in her voice broke something loose inside me, and I found myself telling her everything. The photographs taken without permission, the secret appraisals, the pressure to transfer ownership, the way my own daughter looked at me as if I were already dead, and simply being selfish by not making it official. I see, Margaret said when I finished, her voice heavy with understanding. Jean, what you're describing, it's unfortunately more common than you might think. Adult children sometimes lose sight of their parents' humanity when they start seeing them as sources of inheritance, rather than people deserving of respect and dignity. She explained several options. Specific bequests in my will. Irrevocable. Trusts. Charitable donations. But one possibility caught my attention immediately. A family heritage donation, she explained, allows you to preserve items of historical or sentimental value while ensuring they're properly cared for, displayed, and appreciated by future generations. Many families find it more meaningful than having pieces sit unused in someone's drawer. That phrase, sit unused in someone's drawer, resonated deeply. That's exactly what Sarah had implied about my collection, that beautiful things were wasted on an old woman whose social life had grown quiet with age. The County Historical Society has a wonderful program, Margaret continued. They create permanent family collections with detailed plaques explaining the history and significance of each piece. Your jewelry would be properly preserved, professionally, displayed, and appreciated by hundreds of people every month. I thought about that. Instead of my treasures disappearing into Sarah's jewelry box, emerging only for faculty dinners and school board meetings, they could inspire and educate. Young women could learn about great-grandmother Mabel's strength during the Spanish flu pandemic. Newly married couples could see the emerald bracelet and hear about enduring love. Families could understand how ordinary people create extraordinary legacies through determination and sacrifice. How long would such an arrangement take to complete? I asked. About 3 to 4 weeks, if you're certain. But Jean, have you considered having a heart-to-heart conversation with Sarah first? Sometimes adult children don't realize how hurtful their behavior has become until it's pointed out to them directly. I thought about that suggestion for a long time. In the old days, before Robert died, he might have been the bridge between Sarah and me, the one to help her understand what she was really asking for. Robert had always been good at reaching Sarah during her most stubborn moments, helping her see beyond her immediate desires to larger truths. But Robert had been gone for 8 years now, and Sarah had become someone I barely recognized. Woman who spoke of assets and tax implications instead of family history, who saw dollar signs where she should have seen love letters written in gold and diamonds. Margaret, I raised that girl to value love over money, family heritage over financial gain. If 50 years of motherhood haven't taught her to see beyond price tags to the human heart behind the jewelry, then talking won't either. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is let their child face the consequences of their choices. Over the next 4 weeks, Sarah called regularly, each conversation somehow steering toward my jewelry collection like water flowing downhill. She'd mention upcoming events where she could properly showcase certain pieces, or forward me articles about optimizing estate liquidity for senior citizens. She sent me links to news stories about elderly people whose families had fought over inheritances, presenting these as cautionary tales about the importance of making decisions while you're still competent. That last phrase stung more than she probably intended. While you're still competent, as if my age had already begun compromising my judgment, as if wanting to keep my own jewelry was evidence of diminishing capacity rather than reasonable attachment to meaningful possessions. I spent those 4 weeks writing. Letters, actually, one for each significant piece in my collection. I wrote about where each had come from, what it meant, the memories and emotions attached to every clasp and setting. I wanted Sarah to understand what she'd been so eager to claim, even if she learned too late to appreciate it. I wrote about great-grandmother Clara's journey from poverty to dignity, symbolized by her simple gold wedding band. I described great-grandmother, Mabel's defiance during the Depression, her refusal to sell the ruby brooch because it reminded her that beauty could survive Even the darkest times. I told the story of my mother's pearls, worn to her wedding with hands that shook from nerves. And joy. I shared the memory of Robert fastening the diamond earrings behind my ears on our 25th anniversary. His voice tender as he said, 25 years of loving you, and hopefully 25 more. Each letter was a love story, a piece of family history that no appraisal could capture, no auction house could properly value. 4 weeks later, I invited Sarah over for Sunday dinner, just like old times. I spent the morning making all her favorites: pot roast with vegetables, garlic mashed potatoes, fresh green beans from my garden, and that lemon cake she'd loved since childhood, despite the pain in my arthritic hands as I worked. She arrived, precisely on time as she always did, carrying a small gift bag that made my heart sink. More research, probably. Or perhaps forms she wanted me to sign. "Mom, you seem different today," Sarah observed over dessert, studying my face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "More settled. Peaceful. Have you been thinking about our conversations?" "I've made some decisions," I said, simply rising to clear the table despite her offers to help. My hands felt steadier than they had in weeks, my resolve crystalline. "Sarah, would you join me in the living room? There's something I want to give you." Her eyes lit up with unmistakable anticipation, a gleam I'd come to recognize and dread. This was it, her expression said. Finally, the old woman had come to her senses and accepted the inevitable. I returned from the kitchen carrying Robert's old cigar box. Not my jewelry case, but a simple wooden box that had once held his Sundays. Cigars, still faintly scented with tobacco and memories. Sarah reached for it eagerly, then paused, her enthusiasm dimming slightly as she registered the unexpected container. "Go ahead," I encouraged, settling back into my chair with a calmness that surprised even me. "Open it." Inside was a single key, a folded document bearing the official letterhead of the County Historical Society, and a small leather-bound journal filled with my handwriting. What is this?" Sarah asked, her voice uncertain for the first time in months. "That's the key to a safe deposit box at First National Bank," I explained, my voice steady and clear. "The document is the official donation agreement for the Jean Mitchell Family Heritage Collection, now permanently housed at the County Historical Society. And the journal contains letters I wrote about each piece, their real histories, their actual stories, their true value." Sarah's face went through a fascinating progression of emotions: confusion, disbelief, dawning comprehension, then growing horror. "You donated them? You mean all of them?" "Every single piece," I confirmed. Great-grandmother Clara's wedding band, great-grandmother Mabel's ruby brooch, my mother's pearl necklace, the emerald bracelet from my honeymoon, the diamond, earrings from our 25th anniversary, all of it. They're beautifully displayed now, with professional lighting and detailed plaques telling their stories. The color drained from Sarah's face as the full implications hit her. "You gave away $300,000 worth of jewelry to strangers?" "Not to strangers," I corrected gently. "To history, to people who will appreciate them for what they represent, not what they're worth. To families who will bring their children to learn about the strength and love that jewelry can symbolize when it's properly understood." Sarah stared at the donation document as if it might transform into something else if she looked hard enough. But those belong to our family. They were supposed to be passed down. They are being passed down," I replied. "To future generations who will learn about great-grandmother Mabel's courage during the Spanish flu pandemic, about the love story behind the emerald bracelet, about how ordinary women create extraordinary legacies through determination and sacrifice. Your great-great-granddaughter, if you have one someday, will be able to visit the display and understand where she comes from, what kind of women shaped her heritage. Sarah's voice rose to a pitch I hadn't heard since her teenage years. You can't undo this, can you? There's no way to get them back? I wouldn't want to get them back, I said with quiet certainty. Sarah, I loved you enough to teach you values when you were young. I loved those pieces enough to ensure their stories, survive and inspire others. And I loved myself enough to refuse to be treated like a walking estate sale, pressured into liquidating my memories for someone else's financial convenience. The words hung in the air between us, carrying the weight of disappointment and revelation. Sarah sank back into her chair as if the fight had gone out of her all at once. But what about Emma's wedding someday? What about the grandchildren? You've destroyed our family legacy. No, I said, my voice growing stronger with conviction. I've preserved it. Emma can visit the Jean Mitchell Family Heritage Collection and learn about her great-great-great-grandmother Clara's journey from poverty to dignity. She can see the ruby brooch and understand that beauty can survive even the darkest times. She can admire the emerald bracelet and hear about love that endures across decades. That's a legacy worth preserving. Not jewelry sitting in someone's drawer, but stories that inspire and educate. Sarah began to cry then. Not the angry tears I'd expected, but something deeper and more genuine. When did I become this person, Mom? When did I start seeing dollar signs instead of memories? It was the first real question she'd asked me, in months, and it gave me more hope than anything she'd said all year. I think it happened gradually, I said gently. When financial pressure started outweighing emotional connection. When you began seeing me as elderly rather than experienced. As a source of inheritance rather than a person with feelings and dignity. When you forgot that the woman wearing the jewelry was more important than the jewelry itself. The room fell quiet, except for the sound of Sarah's quiet sobs and the familiar ticking of Robert's grandfather clock in the hallway. I'm sorry, Mom, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I don't know how I lost sight of what really mattered. And in that moment, looking at my daughter's genuine remorse, I felt the first stirring of hope that we might find our way back to each other. That conversation happened 6 months ago, and the healing has been slow, but genuine. Sarah didn't speak to me for 3 weeks after that Sunday dinner. Not from anger, but from shame. When she finally called, her voice carried a humility I hadn't heard since she was a small child who'd broken something precious and wanted to make amends. Mom, she said, I went to see the display at the Historical Society. I waited, my heart beating faster, afraid to hope for too much. There were so many families there, Mom. Grandparents teaching their grandchildren about resilience and love. A young couple looking at great-grandmother's wedding band, talking about their own upcoming marriage. A little girl asking her mother why the ruby brooch was special. And her mother explaining about finding beauty even during hard times. Her voice broke slightly. I watched a grandmother show her granddaughter the emerald bracelet, telling her about the importance of choosing love over comfort, about building something beautiful together, even when life gets difficult. And I realized, I never asked you to teach me those stories. Not really. I just wanted the pretty things. We talked for 3 hours that day, the longest conversation we'd had in years. Sarah told me about the financial pressure she'd been feeling since her divorce, the fear of not being able to provide for Emma and Michael the way she'd been provided for, the panic that had driven her to see my jewelry as a solution rather than a sacred trust. I told her about the loneliness of widowhood, the pain of being seen as a burden rather than a blessing, the fear that my life's treasures would be reduced to line items in an estate sale catalog. Most importantly, I helped her understand that true inheritance isn't about objects. It's about values, stories, the strength to create beauty even in difficult circumstances. Now Sarah visits regularly, but her energy is completely different. She asks about family history, about my childhood memories, about Robert's dreams and disappointments. She brings Emma and Michael to hear stories about their heritage. Not the monetary inheritance they might someday receive, but the legacy of courage, love, and determination they've already inherited simply by being part of our family line. Last month, Emma asked if she could do her senior project on the Jean Mitchell Family Heritage Collection. She interviewed me for hours over several weekends, asking detailed questions about each piece, each woman who wore it, each story behind the sparkle. Watching her eyes light up as she learned about Clara's journey from immigrant poverty to American dignity, about Mabel's defiance during the Depression, about my mother's quiet strength. That was worth more than $300,000 in jewelry. The Historical Society has told me that my collection has become one of their most popular permanent exhibits. They've received similar donations from other families inspired by the idea of preserving heritage rather than hoarding it. The Jean Mitchell Family Heritage Collection has grown into something larger than I ever imagined. A celebration of how ordinary women create extraordinary legacies through love, sacrifice, and the determination to find beauty, even in difficult times. Visitors often tell the docents that seeing the collection changed their perspective on their own family treasures. Instead of seeing valuable objects to be protected or profited from, they begin to understand them as storytelling tools, ways to connect with their ancestry and pass wisdom to future generations. I visit the display every month, usually on quiet weekday mornings when the museum is less crowded. I stand before the elegant glass cases, watching the way professional lighting brings out the fire in great-grandmother's ruby, the luster in my mother's pearls, the deep green depths of my honeymoon emeralds. The plaques beside each piece tell their stories beautifully, with dignity and respect that no auction house catalog could match. Sometimes other visitors approach me when they see my nameplate, wanting to know more about the women behind the jewelry. I'm always happy to share additional stories, to explain how these pieces represent not wealth, but the wealth of spirit that allows ordinary people to create extraordinary legacies. Last week, a young mother brought her 8-year-old daughter to see the collection. The little girl was particularly fascinated by Clara's simple gold wedding band, asking why it was displayed alongside much fancier pieces. "Because," I told her, kneeling down to her level, "that ring represents something more valuable than gold or diamonds. It represents the decision to choose love, to build a family, to create something beautiful, even when you have almost nothing to work with." The little girl studied the ring thoughtfully, then looked at me with those serious eyes that children sometimes have. Did she always know her ring would be in a museum someday? "No, sweetheart." I laughed softly. She just knew that love was worth celebrating, even in a simple way. She could never have imagined that her little gold band would inspire people. More than a century later. As I watched that child absorb the lesson, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with monetary value. This was what inheritance should look like. Not the transfer of objects, but the passing of wisdom, the continuation of values that matter. I learned something profound through this entire experience. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst impulses, even when that someone is your own child. Especially then. Sarah needed to learn that people are more important than possessions, that dignity matters more than dollars, that true wealth lies in the stories we preserve and the love we share. My daughter wanted my jewelry, expecting to inherit objects that would solve her financial concerns. Instead, what she received was far more valuable. A lesson in what inheritance truly means. Not things you acquire, but values you embody. Not treasures you hoard, but wisdom you share. Not wealth you accumulate, but love you multiply by passing. Eat forward. At 80 years old, I've discovered that the greatest treasure I can leave behind isn't made of gold or silver or precious stones. It's the understanding that sometimes, letting go of what seems precious allows you to preserve what truly matters. It's the knowledge that real inheritance isn't about what you take from the past, but what you give to the future. The Jean Mitchell Family Heritage Collection will outlast me by generations. Long after I'm gone, Clara's wedding band will continue teaching children about the courage to build something beautiful from nothing. Mabel's ruby brooch will keep reminding people that beauty can survive even the darkest times. My mother's pearls will continue demonstrating that elegance comes from character, not cash. The emerald bracelet will keep telling the story of enduring love, of partnership that deepens rather than diminishes with time. Sarah understands this now. She brings her children to the museum not to see what they might have inherited, but to learn who they are, where they came from, what kind of strength runs in their blood. She's teaching them that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the depth of love that connects generation to generation. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I imagine Clara looking down from whatever comes after this life, smiling to see how far that simple gold band has traveled, how many hearts it continues to touch. I picture Mabel nodding approvingly as families gather around her ruby brooch, learning about resilience and hope. I see my mother beaming as young brides admire her pearls, understanding that real beauty comes from within. This is what legacy looks like when it's done right. Not objects gathering dust in someone's jewelry box, but stories that continue to inspire, values that continue to guide, love that continues to multiply across generations. Share your thoughts below. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice to teach someone you love an important lesson? What family treasures carry the deepest meaning in your life?